As said, I have worked with Dr. D'Agostino at the University of South Florida, going on this is the end of my 6th year now in his lab, and I'm currently a research associate in his lab, and my talk will be titled Targeting Cancer with Therapeutic Ketosis. So we're kind of switching gears to a really significant, a different significant health problem, which is cancer. It's currently the second leading cause of death in the United States, just second to heart disease, but it's expected to soon overtake heart disease. It's been in a slow decline since the early 1990s, but a lot of this is actually attributed to earlier detection, better preventative measures, and also decreased tobacco use. More so than any really major improvements in the way that we can treat cancer. Some pretty staggering statistics. Currently it's projected that 1 in 2 men and 1 in 3 women will develop cancer at some point in their life, and that 1 in 4 men and 1 in 5 women will end up dying from cancer. So if I'm going to talk to you guys about ways that ketosis or exogenous ketones could potentially be a cancer treatment, first, I think we need to spend a little bit more time on really understanding what is cancer. I mean, everyone in this room, probably, their lives have been touched by cancer in some way. But it can be kind of difficult to conceptualize in a more biological manner. So we're just going to take a little bit of time dissecting what it means to be cancer so that I can later show you how ketosis targets almost every aspect of cancer. So in 2000, some really prominent scientists in the field published a study called The Hallmarks of Cancer. They outlined 6 attributes of a cell that makes it cancerous. Here are 3 of them. The first one, sustaining proliferative signaling. Basically, the cells in our body are able to make copies of themselves. We all know this intuitively, right? Because at one point, we were all just a single cell. And now, obviously, we're trillions of cells. So all of the cells in our body have the capability of dividing. Once we become adults and fully formed adults, most of those cells don't continually do that. Unless maybe you have like a need to regenerate a tissue. Say you have a wound. The skin cells in that area have to divide to grow back. Well, cancer cells acquire this capability to just start dividing again. And they do that continually. Now, most of the cells in our body will listen. There are lots of signals that come from the tissue around it that say, don't divide continuously. That's not good. We don't want that. It can cause cancer. Cancer cells will stop listening to those signals. And essentially, they can do this forever. And that's what that last one is, enabling replicative immortality. They can divide and divide and divide and never stop dividing. There are cancer cells that we use in labs that were taken from patients in the 1960s that are still able to divide. This is a really abnormal thing. Our healthy cells don't do this. And that's essentially what leads to the formation of tissue, or tumors, this unbridled growth of these cells. Next thing, once the tumor starts growing, it has to make new blood vessels for itself, because blood vessels carry all the nutrients to the tissue, right? So that's an important factor in allowing a tumor to grow past a certain size. They have to grow these new blood vessels. They resist cell death. So our cells have this intrinsic fail-safe mechanism called apoptosis, where essentially something's gone wrong. If you have bad mutations in the genome or something, most cells will intrinsically commit suicide. And that's good because it keeps that cell from dividing improperly. The cancer cells won't do that. The last thing is they acquire the capability to move from where they're located and go somewhere else. You guys have probably heard this called metastasis. So you have the cancer cells, part of a primary tumor, but at some point, generally later in the progression of the disease, those cancer cells acquire this new ability to actually leave where they originated from and spread throughout the body. And this is a really critical step in the fight against cancer because metastatic disease is extremely difficult to treat long term. So a lot of our therapies can work on primary tumors, but once cancer has spread from that primary site, it becomes extremely difficult to treat or cure. Okay, sorry. Okay, so that was originally in 2000, and then in 2011, they published an update to the review, kind of adding in, okay, we found some more things out about cancer. They proposed, though there are 2 more emerging hallmarks of the disease, and 2 more enabling characteristics. The enabling characteristics were genome instability and mutation. Usually when you think about cancer, you think about DNA mutations, right? Most people have that in their mind, and this is very true. A cancer cell has hundreds to thousands of individual mutations in its nuclear DNA. Another aspect is tumor promoting inflammation. Inflammation in the area of the tumor is always an acquired characteristic of the tumor itself, and it dramatically exacerbates the progression of the disease. The 2 emerging hallmarks that they spoke about were avoiding immune destruction, was the first one. So all of us have had small cancers in our body. Most of us probably have them right now. But our immune system is actually really good at detecting them. It's the same system that can find a bacteria or a virus when you get sick. It's going around your body, it's finding these cancerous cells and taking care of them, eliminating them. But at some point, in the step to becoming an actual tumor cancer, the cell becomes able to evade the immune system. So it stops being sensed by the immune system. And the last emerging hallmark, which is kind of the major focus of what we're going to be talking about today, is this deregulating cellular energetics. So essentially, all of the energy pathways, the metabolic pathways that take the food that we eat, convert it into forms of energy for the cell to actually use. They're really altered in cancer. They're very, very different. If you look at the metabolic pathways in a brain cancer cell, you compare it to a healthy brain cell, it's very, very different. Now, what's kind of funny about deregulating cellular energetics being described as an emerging hallmark in 2011 is that Otto Warburg in 1931 published this. It's not really an emerging hallmark. It was actually one of the very first things we ever knew about cancer. Long before we had any idea that the genome was chock full of these mutations, we knew that cancer had this really abnormal metabolic phenotype. And so basically what he published is now called the Warburg effect, was that cancer cells, and this is true across cancer types, will undergo really high rates of what's called lactate fermentation. And they do this even in the presence of oxygen. I'm going to explain more so what that means. So, in our healthy cells, I guess it's kind of hard to see this laser, but on the right side is an image of our healthy cells. And you guys said earlier that you know what mitochondria are, right? So they're kind of termed like the powerhouse of the cell. This is where most of the energy in our bodies are made. So our healthy cells are using their mitochondria. They're using it very efficiently to make a lot of ATP, and that's the energy kind of currency of the cell. But if you compare what's happening in a normal cell to a cancer cell, it looks completely different. They're not using their mitochondria. In fact, instead, to make the energy to supply the needs of the cancer cell, they are instead taking up a ton of glucose. Where does glucose come from? Sugar, yeah, carbohydrate. They're taking up a ton of glucose, and they're converting it to lactate. And they're basically kind of ignoring, in this sense, they're not pushing that glucose towards the mitochondria. They're not using their mitochondria. They're actually doing this at a rate of 200 times that of a normal cell. And this is actually the most consistent cancer phenotype. So we keep talking about these mutations. There are different mutations in every cell of even a single tumor. Someone has a tumor, every cell of that tumor has different mutations. This seems to be present to some degree in pretty much all cancer cells of all tumor types. And we can see this by actually looking at one of the most widely used clinical diagnostic tests for cancer. It's called the FDG glucose PET scan. It's basically just drinking radioactive glucose, or sugar. And because of how significant the amount of glucose that cancers are taking up is, you can image it using this PET scan technique. And so all of these black areas are actually tumors. So you can see large and small metastases. This actually was a melanoma that had spread. And so this is so ubiquitous across cancer types that we use it in the clinic to diagnose cancer. When you look at cancer under this image, you see how important glucose is for that cancer. It's sucking it up, literally sucking it up. Okay, so this observation has really led to a lot of debate in the field of cancer research, which is really interesting. Why would cancers be doing this? What is the point of using so much glucose and not using their mitochondria? So it's kind of generally assumed that if you see something that is happening in all of these cancers, it has to be beneficial, because if they're converging upon this one behavior, it's something that every cancer individually was coming to recognize as being a benefit and has adapted to happen. Well, so I said, though, that it's not a really efficient way to make energy, right? Our healthy tissues use our mitochondria. They're way better at making energy. They make a ton more energy per glucose molecule. So it doesn't seem that that could be beneficial at first glance. But as it turns out, the tumors actually do get a lot of benefit from using a ton of glucose. There's kind of a lot of thoughts about this, but essentially the idea is, instead of making a lot of energy from the glucose, they're using it to build new structures. If you're dividing, making all these new cells, you need to make new proteins, you need to make new DNA, you need to make more lipids, and so that's where they think the benefit comes in. And this actually means then that this is a really good therapeutic target, right? And this is something that is in pretty much all cancer cells to some extent. And it's actually very much promoting the aggressive kind of behavior of the cancer. And it's probably something that if we can find a way to block that, that's a good thing, right? Now, another explanation for why cancer has this really strange metabolic phenotype is actually mitochondrial dysfunction. Now, when you look in a variety of ways, when you look at cancer cells, there are widespread abnormalities in the function and composition of the mitochondria. And I won't go into it, but basically, some tumors have very, very low or even non-discernible numbers of mitochondria in them. Almost all of them have abnormal morphology, or and that just means like their shape or function to some degree. But I think the picture on the right really kind of exemplifies that problem. So these are the mitochondria we were talking about. You see the little folds on the inside of the top healthy mitochondria? Okay, that's where mitochondria actually make energy. Those are like the business spots in the mitochondria. Well, what's missing in that brain tumor mitochondria? The folds. They're gone. Or maybe they're very, very reduced. Maybe you can see a few. And the studies that have looked at this have consistently shown that this is a major thing that we see in cancer cells. So if this is where you could potentially make energy in the mitochondria, but these are the kind of mitochondria we're seeing in cancer, maybe this is actually because they can't use the mitochondria, right? So maybe there's a fundamental problem in the way that cancer cells can use their mitochondria, and that's why they have to use glucose so heavily. So keep that in mind as we think about the potential way to treat cancer. And so basically, just coming back to this image, maybe cancer cells are taking in a ton of glucose because it's kind of their only option, because there's an impaired ability to make energy kind of the normal way. And this is a very hotly debated topic, but I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest this. 1930s, this was actually Warburg's original hypothesis as to really what caused cancer. He said that cancer was initially caused by this defect in mitochondrial function, essentially. And this was long before we had electron microscopes that could look at the mitochondria and see there's no folds in there, okay? So he was just proposing that this must be why they're using these alternate pathways. And that's what he proposed was actually the initial cause of cancer, almost 100 years ago. Well, flash forward to today, and we have now a lot of evidence to support that maybe this is actually what's going on. And Dr. Thomas Seaford, who is a really amazing researcher, friend and colleague at Boston College, has published a book called Cancer as a Metabolic Disease. He cites over 1,000 research articles throughout the book to really put together this thesis that very strongly proposes the idea that this is actually maybe the initial cause of cancer. And essentially what he says is that upstream of all of these genetic mutations is actually mitochondrial damage. So that anything that can damage the mitochondria, so things like inflammation or certain mutations or carcinogens or radiation can damage the mitochondria, and that when the mitochondria fail, basically it allows the insult to the nuclear genome, and you have all of these genetic mutations, and that's how you get the hallmarks of cancer. So if you want more in-depth explanation of that idea, I highly recommend this book. It's really an incredible read. Okay, so this kind of leads me to this idea. So for about the past 50 years, definitely the major focus in cancer research has been trying to target these genetic mutations. And there have been some successes. Some cancers can respond pretty well to targeted chemotherapies, but overall there hasn't been very much progress. So what if these mutations that we're all trying to target, and we have been for 50 years, are actually not the root cause? Like, what if they are downstream of these defects in energy metabolism? Would that not be potentially a better therapeutic target? So that's what we kind of think. Now, I say the jury is still out on the metabolic theory of cancer. It's by no means widely accepted that this is the cause of cancer. But I don't think that anyone will really argue with the fact that the Warburg effect and metabolism is still a very good therapeutic target. And so that's what we're trying to do. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, I showed you that cancer cells are sucking up a ton of glucose, right? Like 200 times that of a healthy cell. Cancers really thrive on having an abundant supply of glucose to fuel their growth. We know that high glycemic index diets, so diets where you have high blood glucose, increase the risk of a variety of different cancer types. Having high blood glucose, if you're a patient that has cancer, you have a worse prognosis than if your blood glucose is lower. And in animal studies, we can actually see that blood glucose is directly correlated to tumor growth. So here on the right, this is looking at, on the bottom, glucose concentration in the blood, and on the left, tumor weight. The higher your blood glucose, the larger your tumors. So this leads us to the ketogenic diet, which, thanks to the great presentations from this morning, I don't really have to explain to this crowd. But we know that the ketogenic diet induces a state of ketosis, and it's characterized by lower blood glucose and lower blood insulin and elevated ketones. Now, it's obvious from at this point why lowering glucose might be a good thing if you have cancer, right? But insulin also is a very similar story. Insulin is a very potent growth factor, and it promotes the growth of tumors. So if you're eating a high carbohydrate diet and you're constantly having your pancreas secrete insulin, you're constantly giving a big dose of growth signaling to the tumor. And so this is just what that image on the right is showing. Here's insulin and some similar signaling factors to insulin. And they signal down to the nucleus and basically promote division and growth of the cancer and they promote survival, and they inhibit cell death in the cancer. Now, what's really interesting is because of some fundamental differences in how we metabolize glucose versus ketones, is ketones seem that we know they're an extremely efficient energy source for our healthy tissues, but they don't really seem to be a good energy source for cancer. Well, why is that? Well, ketones are metabolized exclusively in the mitochondria. So those pathways, and if I could use a laser, I would show you, but up here, those pathways that cancer cells are highly upregulating, ketones bypass them completely. They enter the mitochondria directly, and they're metabolized there. Well, I said there's a ton of evidence that mitochondria are probably impaired to some degree in most cancer cells. So if you're replacing glucose with a fuel like ketones, which has to be metabolized in the mitochondria, and most cancers probably have a deficit in their mitochondrial function, that seems like a good switch, right? And at the same time, your healthy tissue's perfectly happy, thriving on ketones as an energy source. Now, and there's a study here on the right that kind of exemplifies this idea. So this is a study in cell culture lines, so it's actually a number of, you can take cancer cells out of a tumor and actually grow them in petri dishes. So they looked at the ability of ketones to replace glucose as a fuel for your healthy brain cells versus brain cancer cells. And what they saw was that if you take away glucose, but you supply ketones to your healthy brain cells, they're fine, totally fine. They can make this switch. But glioma cells, these are brain cancer cells, and they tried 5 different types, so from 5 different brain tumors. None of them were protected from glucose withdrawal death when you gave ketones. They could not make the switch to survive solely on ketones. Yeah, it's pretty cool. So now we've set up this idea where, okay, glucose and insulin really drive cancer growth. It seems like ketones are not an efficient fuel for cancer growth in terms of supplying energy, at least. And that's exactly the basis of the understanding of the ketogenic diet for cancer. And there's actually a lot of animal research looking at the ketogenic diet for cancer, and there's some pretty incredible results. So much that we're finally seeing an upsurgence of the amount of human clinical trials. So just here on the right, I just did a quick search on clinicaltrials.gov. We're seeing in a variety of cancer types that the ketogenic diet is being investigated as an adjuvant treatment in a ton of different cancer types. So we're all very excited about that. Can't wait to see the data that comes out of it. So I'll show you just a little bit of my data that kind of exemplifies the ketogenic diet working. And this is actually an extremely aggressive model of metastatic cancer. So it's a mouse model, and it's basically kind of your worst case scenario. The tumors are extremely aggressive. So basically what we've done is we've manipulated the cancer cells so that they will glow, essentially, when we do this imaging. So on the left, this is a control animal 3 weeks after we give them the cancer cells. The cells spread very rapidly throughout the body. So this is kind of your worst case scenario metastatic cancer type model. And this diet is a standard high carbohydrate diet. I should note though, it's actually a pretty healthy version. So it's optimized for mouse health, right? So it's not like the Western diet that a lot of us are eating cupcakes, right? It's more of a healthy type of high carbohydrate diet. So if we had a Western diet group in here, we'd probably see even worse kind of results. But here we look at 2 different ketogenic diets. We're not restricting calories at all. And we can see at the same point in time, after we've given them the cancer, they have a lot less tumor burden, a lot less tumors, and the spread is decreased. And when we look at their survival curves, we see that the diets on average cause the animals to live about 50% longer. This is purely just changing the diet, and this is again in a very aggressive model of cancer. Okay, so this kind of leads me to the question, we talked about the ketogenic diet. What about ketones themselves? Is it possible that ketones themselves have direct anti-cancer effects? And we've heard today from many of the researchers that ketones are way more than just energy metabolites. They're very potent signaling molecules. So it's possible that some of their other non-metabolic effects could potentially be damaging to cancer. So this was a study by Eugene Fine that kind of hinted at this effect a couple of years ago, where he took 10 patients that had advanced incurable, meaning they had gone through the gamut of chemotherapy, radiation, they were not responding, they had been switched to palliative care, so they weren't receiving therapies at this point, and they had a variety of different cancer types. They switched them to a ketogenic diet for a month, and in that group, which is kind of, again, worst case scenario, 60% had stable disease or partial remission just by changing to the ketogenic diet for 1 month. But what was really interesting was when they looked at the results more closely, they saw that the responders were the ones that had the highest level of ketones. And that actually as a whole, there wasn't really a significant drop in their blood glucose, suggesting that it may have actually been the elevation in ketones that was therapeutic. So let's look at a couple of effects of ketones that may have implications as being an anti-cancer treatment. So Dr. D'Agostino mentioned this earlier. When you give a source of ketones, you have a drop in your blood glucose. And I pointed out earlier that cancers thrive on glucose. They love glucose, right? So if you were to administer ketones and you have a drop in your blood glucose, that could potentially decrease that important fuel for the cancer cell. And as we already said earlier, I think Dr. Volek mentioned that there's some data that ketones actually enhance insulin sensitivity, or maybe Dr. Wilson as well mentioned this. When you give ketones exogenously, there's some studies that suggest a drop in insulin as well. And remember I showed you that figure that showed insulin really driving cancer growth. So we're lowering glucose, lowering insulin. It's potentially going to be damaging to cancer in that way. You've heard today several times people mentioning oxidative stress and free radicals. So do you guys know what a free radical is? It's kind of hard to explain, right? But it's basically it's a compound that's made in our bodies, and they're very highly reactive. And they'll go around and damage things in our cells. They'll damage our DNA, they'll damage our proteins and our lipids so that you kind of reduce their function. So oxidative stress is when you have too many free radicals being made, your antioxidants can't really cope with that, and you get damage to your healthy cells, essentially. And so ketone metabolism reduces oxidative stress. Now, this is important in cancer because oxidative stress can actually promote cancer growth. Now, it's only to a certain limit, though, because you can push oxidative stress and cause the cancer to kind of go over a threshold. But on a kind of basal level, if you can reduce oxidative stress to the tumor, you can probably decrease some of its cancer-promoting effects. And so we know that ketones reduce oxidative stress. There's some papers that showed they do this by being a histone deacetylase inhibitor. Dr. Volek was mentioning it changes gene expression, literally causing our bodies to make more antioxidants. And that's one of the ways. Similarly, they use the same method to regulate gene expression in an anti-cancer fashion, or it's thought that that's probably the mechanism. We know there's some data that the ketogenic diet can alter the gene expression in cancer cells in a way that is bad for the cancer. And it might have to do with their actions as histone deacetylase inhibitors. Pharmaceutical companies are actually out there right now working on creating synthetic histone deacetylase inhibitors. Beta-hydroxybutyrate is one that our body makes naturally. So there are companies out there trying to make a synthetic version of something that We're actually all drinking in our bottles today. So that might be one way that ketones could be modulating gene expression in a tumor. And so we have data to suggest that the ketogenic diet really reverses the gene expression profile of tumors, turning on kind of the brakes. So telling tumors, okay, stop dividing so quickly, initiate that cell death mechanism, and turning down those systems that are telling them to keep growing. So that's one way that ketones could potentially inhibit cancer. Now, ketones also inhibit inflammation. There's a lot of data in the literature out there showing that on a ketogenic diet, you have a reduction of a lot of inflammatory markers. We know that inflammation, remember I said that's one of the, I think it was an enabling characteristic of cancer was inflammation. So if you're decreasing inflammation, you could potentially be damaging the cancer that way. Here on the right is actually some of the data that came out of our lab looking at a variety of exogenous ketones and their ability, these are a number of inflammatory markers. Many of them are pro-inflammatory, and you see a lot of them are really turned down, and this is just by supplementing with exogenous ketones on top of a normal higher carbohydrate diet. Ketosis with the ketogenic diet, or in this case, also adding ketone supplements on top of a ketogenic diet, we showed a reduction in the vascularization of tumors. So remember, I said that if a tumor is going to grow very big, it has to build new blood vessels. It's the only way it can kind of grow past a certain size. And what we see when we look really closely at the tumors in those animals from our studies, we see that their tumors are much less vascularized and they're smaller, probably in part because they had some kind of inhibition of growing those new blood vessels. This is another really interesting aspect of how ketosis could potentially be a cancer therapy. So ketones are muscle sparing. We've heard that over and over this morning. Probably most of you, if you've known someone who has gone through cancer treatment and unfortunately if they've succumbed to the disease, you probably noticed that towards the end they had lost a lot of weight. So the tumor actually will cause breakdown of our healthy protein in our muscles in our body. And you stack that on top of a lot of these patients are getting chemotherapies that exacerbate that effect. That's called cachexia. It's that loss of lean muscle mass and body mass that happens in the end stage of a cancer patient. And actually, it's thought that cachexia directly contributes to death from cancer in about 30% of patients who die from cancer. So ketones are muscle sparing. They prevent the breakdown of our body muscle. So potentially if you can kind of stave off that lean muscle mass in an individual who has cancer, you could potentially slow progression of the disease or keep them healthier, give them a better fighting chance to tackle that disease. And there's some evidence to suggest this. So on the right, here's a paper looking at ketone bodies, and I think it was in the ketogenic diet model, was able to reduce cachexia. So we slowed tumor growth, but slowed the wasting of the body size as well. There is some evidence that is kind of newer. It's coming out. Actually, I saw it presented at a conference last year from our collaborator, Dr. Adrienne Scheck. She was looking at the ability of the ketogenic diet to reactivate the immune system, basically turning on the immune system where it's now able to recognize cancer again. So remember how I said that at some point during cancer development, it becomes evasive to the immune system. But she has some really incredible data that hopefully will be published soon showing that the ketogenic diet actually turns back on the cytotoxic activity of the immune system, so it's able to reattack that tumor. Okay, so I just said a lot of attributes of ketones in general that could potentially be damaging to cancer. Almost all of the data regarding ketosis and cancer is with the ketogenic diet. And it led us in our lab to the question, what do ketones themselves, independent of carbohydrate restriction, could supplemental or exogenous ketones actually have a similar result or some kind of therapeutic result? And so we, as you know, in our lab look at a variety of sources of exogenous ketones. And that's what we started to do in the cancer models in our lab. Here, some of this is our data, some is from other researchers. Basically, we showed that if you add ketones to cell culture media where cancer cells are growing, you can slow their ability to divide. And so we see that in our model, which was glioblastoma or brain cancer derived. It's been shown in lymphoma cells, melanoma cells, kidney cancer cells, cervical cancer, colon cancer, breast cancer cell lines. So ketones seem kind of across the board to be able to slow the ability of cancer cells to divide. And if we think about what that could potentially mean in an actual intact organism, that might mean slower tumor growth. Now here it's kind of hard to see. I guess you can see it a little better over here. On the left, this is a technique we use in the lab. It's a nice kind of microscopy technique, but basically the red dots are dead cells, and the green dots are live cells. And this is in the presence of all the glucose the cancer cells could want, 25 millimolars, very high glucose. If we add ketones, just a pretty normal, like physiological range of ketones to that scenario, you see there's a much greater amount of dead cells to live cells, right? And this is just with 24 hours. Just adding ketones in the presence of glucose. So aside from glucose or carbohydrate restriction. When we look at our animal model, we actually saw a kind of similar effect to what we saw with our ketogenic diet studies. And this is just using exogenous ketones. So on top of, the animals are eating a standard carbohydrate diet, but about 20% of their calories are coming from an exogenous ketone. And so the two on the right are two different types of exogenous ketones that we looked at. And again, you can see at the same point in time, after receiving the cancer cells, there's a lot less tumor and it's spreading at a slower rate. And when we look at their survival, we saw that the exogenous ketone supplementation in this model was as effective as the ketogenic diet. Sorry. Okay, so then we thought, well, okay, if that worked well and the ketogenic diet worked well, what if we can combine them? And so we did. So we looked at combining the ketogenic diet with ketone supplementation, hopefully with the goal of putting more metabolic pressure on the cancer cells. And we did see a better effect. So we saw smaller tumors and smaller tumor growth.
Wow.
And this is actually a study where we removed the organs at a certain time point and measured the amount of tumor cells in each individual organ. So this is really giving us a very in-depth look at how many cancer cells have spread to which areas of the body. The black bars are the standard high carbohydrate animals, and the green bars are the ketogenic diet and ketone supplement treated animals. And you can just see a very nice reduction of spread. And when we looked at their survival time, it also had a slightly more potent increase in survival time. So these animals are now living 60 to 65% longer than our control animals. So, could ketosis, so that's been looking at ketosis kind of as a standalone treatment. Well, could it actually be an effective adjuvant therapy for cancer? So there's a little bit of data looking at pairing the ketogenic diet with standard of care, like chemotherapy or radiation. This is a really awesome study from Dr. Scheck's lab again, where basically she showed that the ketogenic diet or radiation therapy in a mouse model of brain cancer both increased survival time, but neither of them cured any animals. When she combined the ketogenic diet with radiation therapy, I think it was 81% of the animals survived.
Whoa.
And she actually switched them back to a standard high carbohydrate diet, I think 100 days in, followed them for another 100 days, never saw a recurrence of the tumor. So she's actually doing some human studies right now with this. I'm really, really excited to see the results of that data. And other encouraging results have been shown looking at chemotherapy and ketogenic diet. And then I wanted to show you just a little bit of data from the work that we did in our lab looking at the ketogenic diet or ketosis, combining it with hyperbaric oxygen. And this is just, Dr. D'Agostino actually mentioned it earlier as a therapy for a number of different disorders, but essentially it's a way to kind of shut down some of the signaling pathways that promote cancer growth. And so it's a non-toxic adjuvant. As long as you stay within kind of the known boundaries of hyperbaric oxygen, you can consider it to be non-toxic. So when we combine ketosis with hyperbaric oxygen, we really saw a dramatic reduction in survival of the cancer cells and a dramatic reduction in their ability to grow and divide. And when we look at the animals, actual tumor burden in the animals, these guys on the far right were receiving the ketogenic diet, supplemental ketones, and hyperbaric oxygen really had a dramatic response. Their tumors grew very, very slowly. Very, very slow tumor growth. And when we looked at the individual organs, most of them had no discernible spread to the organs. And when we followed them out all the way through their lifespan, they lived twice as long. 100% increase in survival time. Okay, so basically what I wanted to show you today, I'm going to talk about the hallmarks of cancer and how ketosis actually targets nearly every hallmark of cancer, and there's data to really support those statements. And these are very, very encouraging preliminary results. Like I said, the ketogenic diet is in clinical trials in a number of cancer types right now. The exogenous ketones thing is extremely novel for cancer, but we're really excited to be moving that forward, and there's a lot of interest, and we have a lot of potential collaborators where we're going to be exploring that in other cancer models, and hopefully in humans at some point in the future. So we need more studies on this topic, but right now I'm extremely encouraged by what we're seeing, and I hope that as we receive the human studies from the clinical trials, we'll be just as encouraged. And I just want to say thanks again for coming. Also, a major thank you to our lab, most notably Dr. D'Agostino, who's just been an incredible mentor and friend for a very long time. And I'll take any questions you may have.
Where the science and research is going, it really is. So we're going to take a handful of questions. So, all right, choose it.
Hi, I'm Sandra Jean Bully from Lakeland, Florida. And if us healthy people, it only takes one scoop of Pruvit to maintain whatever we're going to be doing, whatever. But how about if you have cancer? Would it be advisable to do more of it, do you think? Does anybody think?
Well, so that's a really good question. It's hard because right now, like I said, the exogenous ketones is really a really novel thing in cancer research. There's been our study, which was incredibly encouraging, but I won't pretend to know how that's going to pan out in humans or the exact, if it does pan out in humans, what kind of dose you would want to do. So the studies that so far have happened suggest that being in a metabolic zone, so where your blood glucose is decreased and your blood ketones are elevated, in our animal models seems to be the most therapeutic, getting your blood glucose lower and your blood ketones higher, as long as you're within a healthy range. But I would definitely expect that that's probably going to be the case as well in humans, but I can't say for sure. I don't know either. I wish I did. We're doing the studies. We want to find out as quickly as we can, but.
Sandra Miller, and I'm from Davenport, Florida. So when you're doing these studies, would it be correct for me to assume that you're probably going to be looking at blood ketone levels, but that won't translate into human ketone levels, I'm guessing, as well. But at some point, would there be a way for you to take what you've learned from the animals and translate that into, a millimolar? Like it's going to be between this and this.
Yeah,
Millimolar, that's going to be the most protective level. And is that the goal? Is that where it's going?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we do, we track millimolar concentration in our animals. It might take different doses of different caloric intake, different dietary approaches, or different doses of the supplements to get to a certain ketone level, but we kind of expect that once the elevation in ketones that we see in animals that's therapeutic, a lot of times seem to also be therapeutic in humans. So we're actually looking at a dose, like say we in our animal study saw 2 millimolar blood ketones, and those were therapeutic. A lot of the studies where there have been correlated human studies at 2 millimolar are also therapeutic. So I'm not saying that's happened in cancer yet, but I think we can kind of use the animal data to predict what would happen in humans. It's never going to be a perfect prediction because that's how science is, but it's the best model we have so far.
Probably just like bio-individual person.
Absolutely, and there's a lot of individual variability.
Hi, I'm Alayla Hervis from Miami, and these studies are the animals just being tested on the tumor, or are they taking radiation or chemo or anything like that?
So the only thing that I showed you that had standard of care in it was the brain tumor study where I said that she combined radiation with the ketogenic diet, and that was a mouse model of brain cancer. All of the glowing animal studies that I showed were either just the ketogenic diet, ketone supplements, or also including hyperbaric oxygen. So none of the studies we've run in our lab so far we've combined with standard of care, although I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that these types of metabolic therapies can sensitize tumors to standard of care. It's exactly what Dr. Scheck showed, that you actually respond better to chemotherapy, better to radiation if you are in ketosis. That's at least what the animal models would suggest happening. And the human trials are all ongoing with standard of care, so we'll have the answer to that question probably soon.
Thank you, Doctor. My name is Danny Wood from Oklahoma City. We have a lady in Texas who has went to radiation twice, and she's so weak she can't walk. And her brother-in-law was going to buy this and give it to her. But he said that her appetite is so low after the radiation that she can't hardly eat. And he's afraid that this suppressing your appetite would give her some less benefits than it would if it wasn't suppressing your appetite. Can you help us with that? Would that hurt her, help her, anything like that?
That's a really good question. It's probably going to be very dependent on her exact scenario. I think probably some individuals might experience that and some might not. I really can't say that I could predict.
My name is Tony Allen. We've been talking a lot about cancer tumors. What about benign tumors? Is there anything there that has been tested?
Not really. So most of the research has been on cancerous tumors because that's the biggest problem in the health community in the cancer realm. So I can't say that I have seen hardly any research on benign tumors. I will go back to say your question previously. In individuals who do have cancer and are having difficulty consuming calories, that sometimes that you could imagine that it could be therapeutic just to have an extra source of calories. So whether or not she would have some kind of appetite suppression, I really don't know. But in an individual that's not able to actually get in enough calories finding some way to get in more calories could be beneficial.
Would the muscle sparing effect also be potentially
Yeah.
beneficial?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Any other questions? Here we go.
Steve Welch from Chicago, from West Palm Beach, Florida. Can you expand a little bit about the types of cancer that you've researched? I know you said that there's a lot of cancers across all types have some of these metabolic opportunities. I mean, are there certain types that show a greater affinity for ketones versus other types?
So some of that work has been done. Most of the research looking at ketosis, largely with the ketogenic diet, as I said again, ketone supplementation is incredibly novel and is nowhere near, I don't think, human clinical trials points, but it's encouraging, right? But the data has been the mostly represented in brain cancer, and that could be for a number of reasons. It might have to do with something that brain cancer patients also will sometimes have seizures, and there's the link between using ketones and ketogenic diet to prevent seizures. So most of the data is in brain tumors, but there have been sprinklings of research papers from a variety of different cancer types. I think I showed some data from lymphoma cells and kidney cancer and pancreatic cancer, and it's really kind of here or there, because there's not a ton of research on this going on. There's definitely been no streamlined process to try to mark cancer types off the list and see whether or not they respond. But the fact that all of these different kinds of types that we've seen respond are all responding is very encouraging.
I want to ask a question.
Okay.
What about, we've been talking about treatment aspects, but what about prevention? Is there anything that's going into that aspect?
That we need to do that study. We absolutely do. It's really not been done. I mean, we know from epidemiological, reports that having a high glucose, high glycemic index diet, having high blood glucose, having diabetes, which is also associated with that kind of metabolic phenotype, increases your propensity to get cancer. We also have some anecdotal reports from communities that have historically eaten very low carbohydrate, like the Inuit, having very low cancer prevalence. But there's really not been a concerted effort to determine if ketosis, vegan ketosis, could prevent the development of cancer. For a couple of reasons, it can be kind of difficult to model a spontaneous occurrence of cancer in the lab. But I would suspect that there would be a protective, just because of what we know about the metabolic effects. But we don't have the data.
Well, I guess if you're feeling good and energized and happy, probably would just help in general, right?
Yeah, I mean, I feel better.
There you go. All right. Well, thank you so much,
Yeah.
Dr. Poff. Truly appreciate it.